In the spring of 1856, Natchez, Mississippi, was home to some of the richest families in America. White-columned mansions lined the bluffs above the Mississippi River, their owners hosting lavish dinners while the rest of the nation whispered about rebellion and collapse. But buried beneath that wealth was a truth so dangerous that when it finally surfaced, 56 aristocratic names vanished from society records almost overnight. The cause was not a war, not a disease, not an uprising. It was a single enslaved boy, quiet, observant, underestimated, who learned how power truly worked and decided to turn it against those who believed themselves untouchable. Before we move any deeper into what follows, I need you to understand something important, because stories like this were never meant to survive. If narratives pulled from the darkest corners of history, stories where the voiceless quietly reshape the fate of the powerful, hold your attention, then now is the moment to subscribe to Born into Darkness, hit the bell icon, and leave a comment telling me how this story makes you feel as it unfolds. These are not legends meant to comfort, they are truths dressed as whispers, and once you hear them, they don't let go. In the year 1856, Natchez, Mississippi was not merely a town, it was a monument to American wealth built on denial. Perched high above the Mississippi River, its white-columned mansions glowed in the southern sun like temples to permanence, their owners convinced that nothing beneath them could ever reach so high. Cotton money flowed freely, dinner tables overflowed with silver and imported wine, and the city's aristocracy spoke of legacy as if it were guaranteed by blood alone. Yet beneath that elegance existed an unspoken rule that governed everything. Silence was survival. Crimes were buried with the same care as family secrets, and reputations were protected not through innocence, but through influence. Into this world moved a boy so unremarkable that no one bothered to truly see him. His name, as recorded in plantation ledgers, was Isaiah. No surname, no precise birth year, no lineage worth noting. He was listed simply as house servant, male, capable, observant, an almost accidental description that later read like a warning no one heeded. Isaiah belonged to the Beaumont estate, one of Natchez's most respected families, and from sunrise to well after dusk, he existed in the narrow spaces between power, holding doors open, carrying sealed letters, refilling glasses, standing motionless against walls while conversations unfolded inches from his ears. He was everywhere, and because of that, he was believed to be nowhere at all. Isaiah learned early that invisibility was not a weakness, but a kind of armor. The white men who owned Natchez spoke freely in front of him, assuming that an enslaved boy could neither understand nor remember what he heard. They spoke of land disputes resolved through intimidation, of rivals ruined by false accusations, of women quietly sent away after inconvenient pregnancies, of men who fell into rivers at night and were never spoken of again. They laughed when they told these stories, voices low but careless, reassured by the idea that power itself erased consequence. Isaiah absorbed it all without reaction. He kept his eyes lowered, his hands steady, his expression neutral, yet inside his mind something precise and dangerous was forming. He noticed patterns, how certain names caused sudden pauses, how certain topics shifted moods instantly, how some guests arrived drunk and left pale. He memorized the way handwriting differed from man to man, how some sealed letters were pressed too lightly, how wax cracked when reopened. When he was sent to other estates with messages, he paid attention to which doors he was allowed to approach and which he was told to avoid, learning the architecture of secrecy long before he understood its full meaning. What made Isaiah different was not rage, at least not at first. It was curiosity sharpened by injustice. He understood, even as a boy, that Natchez ran not on morality but on leverage. Every great family held something over another, an affair, a forged document, a stolen inheritance, a death disguised as illness. These secrets formed an invisible web binding the aristocracy together, and Isaiah stood at the center of it without a single one of them realizing it. While they debated politics and profit, he learned the true language of power, fear. He saw how quickly confident men unraveled when they believed their past might surface, how generosity evaporated when exposure loomed. Slowly, deliberately, Isaiah began cataloging what he heard, not on paper yet, but in memory, constructing a private archive more accurate than any courthouse record. He learned that no crime in Natchez was ever truly solitary. Each was connected to another through silence, payment, or shared guilt. And in that realization, something shifted. He understood that the very system that crushed him depended entirely on the belief that those it crushed could never speak back. The Beaumont household provided Isaiah with his first education in hypocrisy. Publicly, the family attended church, donated to charities, and hosted gatherings that reinforced their image as pillars of the community. Privately, Isaiah heard Beaumont men argue about how much blood was acceptable to protect a land claim, listened as visiting politicians discussed manipulating courts, and watched enslaved people disappear after knowing too much. One night, while serving drinks at a late gathering, Isaiah overheard a drunken confession that would become the first crack in Natchez's facade, a respected landowner admitting to pushing a rival's son into the river years earlier during a dispute over property lines. The room laughed it off, assuming bravado, but Isaiah recognized the tremor in the man's voice, the way his hand shook when he lifted his glass. That was the moment Isaiah understood something irreversible. These men were not fearless, they were haunted, and haunting required memory. Isaiah did nothing at first. That restraint would later terrify those who learned of him. He waited. He continued to serve, to listen, to move between households as trust in his obedience grew. The more invisible he appeared, the more access he gained. He delivered letters between men who did not trust one another, watched as wives cried behind closed doors, and saw servants beaten for infractions that existed only to reinforce hierarchy. Each injustice hardened something inside him, but it also clarified his strategy. Violence would only confirm every lie told about him. Escape would erase his power entirely. What Isaiah was building required proximity. It required patience. It required the masters to believe they were still in control. He began to test his understanding carefully, leaving no trace. A misplaced comment here. A question asked at precisely the wrong moment. Watching reactions became his education. He learned how quickly panic spread, how easily men turned on one another when threatened, how fragile the illusion of unity truly was. By the time Isaiah was 16, or perhaps 17, no one bothered to record it, he understood Natchez better than its rulers did. He knew which aristocrats were linked through shared crimes, which marriages existed purely to bury scandal, which men had paid doctors to falsify death records, and which women carried secrets that could unravel entire bloodlines. The city's power structure revealed itself to him as something organic, something alive, and therefore something capable of decay. And decay, Isaiah realized, could be accelerated.
Yet even then, revenge was not his primary motivation. What drove him was something colder and more deliberate: balance.
If silence had protected the powerful, then memory would become his counterweight. He did not yet know how many would fall, or how far the damage would spread. He only knew that the system relied on the belief that no one beneath it could understand it, and Isaiah understood it completely. This is where the story truly begins, not with an act of rebellion, not with bloodshed, but with a boy standing quietly against a wall in a Natchez mansion, listening as men bragged about crimes they believed were buried forever. They did not see him, they did not fear him, and because of that, they handed him the very weapon that would one day destroy them. As Isaiah's understanding of Natchez deepened, so too did his awareness of how carefully the city trained its powerful to believe in their own invincibility, and how that belief rested almost entirely on the assumption that no one beneath them possessed the capacity to connect fragments into truth. After the night he overheard the drunken confession about the river drowning, Isaiah began listening differently, not merely absorbing words but mapping the emotional terrain in which those words were spoken, noting when bravado masked fear, when laughter arrived too quickly, when silence lingered just long enough to reveal discomfort. He realized that secrets did not exist in isolation. They clustered, reinforcing one another like bricks in a hidden wall, and once you found the seam, the entire structure could be weakened. Isaiah began to identify those seams. He noticed that certain men never attended gatherings together, not out of rivalry but out of mutual knowledge, that certain families exchanged visits with exaggerated warmth that bordered on performance, that certain doctors were summoned far more often than illness alone could explain. He learned which enslaved people were suddenly transferred after witnessing something they should not have seen, and which white overseers were rewarded for keeping their mouths shut. None of this required literacy yet, it required attention, and Isaiah's attention was relentless. Each errand became reconnaissance. Each polite nod became an opportunity to observe. He learned to measure rooms by sound alone, to recognize individuals by footsteps, to distinguish anger from fear in the way a man breathed when he thought no one important was listening. Natchez's aristocracy believed themselves masters of narrative, but Isaiah saw the cracks in that narrative everywhere. Tiny inconsistencies that only someone without the luxury of distraction would ever notice. It was during this period that Isaiah began to understand the true function of violence within the system. Violence was not merely punishment, it was a language, one spoken to enforce forgetting. Beatings erased defiance, sales erased witnesses, and death erased inconvenient truths. Yet violence also produced something unintended, patterns. Isaiah saw that the same families were repeatedly involved when problems needed to disappear, that certain plantations served as dumping grounds for troublemakers, that some sheriffs arrived suspiciously late to crime scenes, while others arrived too quickly, already knowing what story would be told. This repetition fascinated Isaiah. It meant predictability, and predictability meant vulnerability. He began to anticipate events before they occurred, sensing when tension was building, when a secret was about to slip loose. Sometimes he tested his instincts in small ways, asking an apparently innocent question at precisely the wrong moment, watching as a conversation froze, eyes darting toward him before remembering that he was supposed to be incapable of understanding. Those reactions confirmed what he already suspected. The masters were terrified of being truly seen, and Isaiah was seeing everything. As months passed, Isaiah's role within the Beaumont household subtly expanded. His reliability earned him more responsibility, more movement, more exposure. He was trusted to deliver letters at night, to wait outside closed doors, to accompany guests to their carriages after heavy drinking had loosened tongues. R&D men argue about inheritances that had been altered, about sons who must never return, about bribes paid to judges whose names were spoken with reverence. One evening, while standing quietly in a study, Isaiah witnessed two men destroy documents in the fireplace, their hands shaking as the flames consumed proof of something unforgivable. They spoke openly, believing the boy behind them to be nothing more than furniture. Isaiah memorized every word, every name, every date mentioned in panic. That night, he lay awake not with rage but with clarity. He understood now that Natchez did not fear rebellion, it feared revelation. The city could crush uprisings with force, but it could not survive exposure without devouring itself. That realization reshaped Isaiah's purpose. He was no longer simply listening. He was preparing. What Isaiah began to learn next was the rhythm of confession. Wealthy men, he discovered, could not help themselves. They needed witnesses, even false ones. They needed to speak their crimes aloud to reassure themselves of their own power. They confessed in fragments, in jokes, in drunken boasts, in moments of self-pity when they framed themselves as victims of circumstance. Isaiah learned when to be near and when to vanish, when presence invited disclosure and when absence provoked it. He learned that men spoke more freely when they believed themselves morally justified, when they convinced themselves that their actions were necessary, even noble. Isaiah did not challenge these justifications. He let them speak. He let them dig. He let them believe. Over time, he began to categorize what he heard: crimes of greed, crimes of desire, crimes of fear. Each category came with its own weakness. Greed created paper trails, desire created witnesses, fear created mistakes. Isaiah's mental archive grew increasingly sophisticated. evolving from a collection of facts into a strategic map of vulnerabilities. He did not yet act on this knowledge, but the patience required to hold it became its own discipline, one that hardened him in ways the masters could never imagine. It was during a routine delivery to a neighboring estate that Isaiah encountered the first person who hinted, ever so slightly, that he was not as invisible as others believed. An older enslaved man, tasked with managing horses, caught Isaiah's eye and held it for just a moment too long. There was no accusation in the look, only recognition. Later, as Isaiah waited in the stable yard, the man spoke quietly without turning his head, about the dangers of listening too closely, about how walls carried sound but also memory. Isaiah said nothing, but he understood the warning and the respect embedded within it. That moment mattered. It confirmed that Isaiah was not alone in his awareness, even if he was alone in his position. It also reminded him that trust was dangerous. Knowledge shared could become knowledge betrayed. From that point on, Isaiah guarded his thoughts more carefully than ever, revealing nothing of his inner world. He understood that survival required isolation as much as intelligence. As 1856 progressed, Natchez society grew increasingly anxious, though few could articulate why. There were rumors of unrest elsewhere, whispers of abolitionists, murmurs of political instability, but beneath those public concerns lay a more personal unease. Men began drinking earlier in the day. Arguments erupted over minor slights. Old grudges resurfaced. Isaiah recognized this atmosphere immediately. Fear was fermenting, and fear, when left unattended, produced confessions. The first deliberate test of Isaiah's growing power came not through action, but omission. He allowed a letter to arrive slightly later than intended, just enough to provoke anxiety. The recipient panicked, convinced someone else had seen it, and in that panic revealed more than the letter ever contained. Isaiah watched the chain reaction unfold without intervening, astonished by how quick. Trust collapsed when secrecy felt threatened. That single delay taught him something crucial. He did not need to fabricate lies. Truth, once disturbed, was destructive enough on its own. By late summer, Isaiah began committing certain details to physical form, though cautiously. Scraps of paper, hidden where no one would look, marked with symbols rather than words, references only he could decode. This was not recklessness, it was necessity. Memory, however sharp, could fail under exhaustion or injury. Isaiah understood that his archive needed redundancy, layers of protection. Yet even as he began this dangerous step, he remained disciplined. Nothing he recorded could implicate him directly. Everything was deniable, ambiguous, fragmentary. He was not building a confession, he was building leverage. The masters still saw him as obedient, even grateful, occasionally praising his demeanor, never questioning his presence. That was their fatal error. They believed domination erased complexity, that enslavement stripped a person of interior life. Isaiah's interior life, however, had become vast and precise, shaped by necessity into something sharper than any blade. What Isaiah felt toward the men whose secrets he carried was not simple hatred. It was something colder, something closer to judgment. He had watched them rationalize cruelty, excuse murder, and destroy lives while maintaining the illusion of virtue. He had seen how easily they forgot the names of those they harmed, how readily they rewrote history to absolve themselves. Isaiah did not forget. He could not afford to. Each secret he learned felt less like ammunition and more like a burden, a weight that pressed him toward action, even as caution restrained him. He understood that once he crossed a certain line, there would be no return, no safety in invisibility. The system would either collapse around him or consume him entirely. Yet as he listened to another night of laughter built on buried crimes, Isaiah realized something else, something decisive. The system was already collapsing. It simply did not know it yet. And Isaiah, standing quietly in the corner, holding a tray no one noticed, was about to decide when it would begin. The decision did not arrive as a dramatic vow or a sudden spark of courage, but as a quiet, almost clinical acceptance that the next phase could no longer be delayed, because the longer Isaiah remained only an observer, the more the secrets he carried began to corrode him from within, and the city itself seemed to sense that something unseen was shifting beneath its polished surface. What changed first was not his behavior but his posture toward risk. He began to test the elasticity of the world around him, introducing pressure in ways so subtle that no one could identify a source, only an effect. A misplaced object here, a misremembered phrase there, a moment of silence where reassurance was expected. Each small disturbance produced ripples, and Isaiah studied those ripples carefully, watching who panicked, who deflected, who blamed others too quickly. Natchez society, so proud of its rigid hierarchy, revealed itself to be astonishingly fragile once its assumptions were unsettled. Men who had built fortunes on certainty unraveled at the suggestion of scrutiny. Women who had perfected composure faltered when confronted with ambiguity. Isaiah learned that fear did not need a face to spread, it only needed uncertainty. He began to understand how rumor functioned as both shield and weapon in this world, how half-truths could be more devastating than accusations, because they forced the guilty to reveal themselves through overcorrection. He never spoke these rumors aloud. He simply allowed conditions in which they might thrive, planting nothing but silence and watching imagination do the rest. As Isaiah's influence expanded, so did his awareness of the moral complexity of what he was becoming. He was no longer merely surviving, he was shaping out sea. Ohms. He grappled privately with the weight of that power, understanding that every choice carried consequences, not just for those who deserved exposure, but for those collateral lives bound to them by blood, labor, or dependence. Yet the system itself offered no clean alternatives. Innocence, Isaiah had learned, was a luxury afforded only to those protected by power. Everyone else paid for its absence. He thought often of the enslaved people quietly removed from plantations after witnessing something they should not have seen, of women whose reputations were destroyed to preserve men's secrets, of children born into lies that would eventually devour them. These thoughts did not harden Isaiah, they clarified him. He began to see his actions not as vengeance but as correction, a rebalancing of truth in a world that had tilted too far toward concealment. Still he moved slowly. Impatience was the enemy. The men he watched had survived decades by anticipating threats and eliminating them early. Isaiah understood that the greatest danger lay not in exposure, but in premature exposure. The first significant escalation came when Isaiah allowed himself to be seen, just barely, as more perceptive than he should have been. It happened during a late-night gathering when a visiting planter, deep in his cups, spoke carelessly about a bribe paid to suppress testimony in a land dispute that had ended with a suspicious death. Isaiah, standing nearby, reacted not with confusion but with a fleeting look of comprehension. Quickly masked, but not quickly enough, the man noticed. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met, and something passed between them that had never existed before, recognition. The planter laughed it off, but his laughter was brittle, his confidence shaken. Isaiah knew immediately that he had crossed an invisible threshold. From that moment on, he was no longer entirely invisible. He was still underestimated, still dismissed, but no longer assumed to be incapable of understanding. That shift was dangerous, but it was also necessary. Power required acknowledgement. Even if that acknowledgement came in the form of fear, in the days that followed, Isaiah noticed subtle changes in how certain men behaved around him. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms, jokes grew more guarded, instructions became more specific, less trusting. These were warning signs, but also confirmations. Isaiah had become a variable, and variables disrupted systems built on control. He responded by becoming more careful, retreating just enough to avoid suspicion while maintaining the tension he had introduced. It was a delicate balance, one that required constant recalibration. He began to rely more heavily on patterns than on proximity, reducing his exposure while increasing his reach. Information came to him now not only through overheard words, but through reactions, through what people chose not to say, through sudden changes in behavior that revealed more than confession ever could. He watched alliances shift, watched men seek reassurance from one another, watched old secrets resurface under the strain of paranoia. Natchez was beginning to eat itself alive, and no one could identify the cause. It was during this period that Isaiah identified the network that would eventually collapse everything, a loose but deeply entrenched circle of aristocrats who shared not only wealth but mutual culpability. These men had protected one another for years, trading favors, suppressing scandals, ensuring that any threat to one became a threat to all. They believed this interdependence made them invincible. Isaiah saw instead that it made them brittle. Their survival depended on absolute trust, and trust was the first casualty of fear. Isaiah began to study this network obsessively, mapping connections, noting who deferred to whom, who held leverage over which scandal. He discovered that beneath the appearance of unity lay resentment, envy, and barely restrained hostility. Each man believed himself the smartest, the most cautious, the least likely to fall. Isaiah intended to exploit that arrogance. The method he envisioned did not involve public accusation or dramatic revelation. Those approaches were too crude, too easily countered. Instead, Isaiah focused on controlled exposure, on forcing individuals within the network to believe they were being singled out, betrayed by their own allies. He orchestrated situations in which men received anonymous warnings that hinted at shared secrets without naming names, messages that suggested knowledge without revealing sources. These warnings were not written, they were implied through circumstances, through misplaced documents, through questions asked by the wrong person at the wrong time. The effect was immediate and profound. Men began to confront one another privately, accusations masked as concern, threats disguised as loyalty. The network tightened, then strained. Isaiah observed all of this from a distance, careful never to be at the center of any storm. As tensions escalated, mistakes multiplied. One man, desperate to secure his position, attempted to eliminate a perceived weak link by framing him for a crime. The plan backfired spectacularly, drawing attention from authorities who had previously been content to look away. Another, attempting to buy silence, paid too much, too publicly, attracting questions he could not answer. Isaiah did not intervene. He did not need to. The system was unraveling under the weight of its own corruption. He simply ensured that pressure continued to be applied evenly, never enough to trigger immediate collapse, but always enough to prevent recovery. It was slow, methodical, and terrifying in its efficiency. Throughout this process, Isaiah remained acutely aware of his own vulnerability. He took precautions, altering routines, avoiding patterns, ensuring that no single individual could plausibly trace events back to him. He maintained his facade meticulously, performing obedience with an artistry that bordered on deception. Yet beneath that performance, his internal landscape grew increasingly complex. He experienced moments of doubt, flashes of fear that he was awakening forces beyond his control. He knew that exposure, once begun, could not be neatly contained. Innocent lives would be affected, violence might follow. But he also knew that doing nothing guaranteed continued suffering, guaranteed that the powerful would remain unchallenged. Isaiah did not romanticize his role. He saw himself not as a hero but as a catalyst, a necessary disruption in a system that thrived on silence. By the time autumn arrived, Natchez was no longer merely uneasy, it was on edge. Whispers circulated openly now, no longer confined to back rooms. Authorities began asking questions they had never asked before. Old cases were revisited. Testimonies once dismissed were suddenly reconsidered. The aristocracy responded with a mixture of outrage and desperation, demanding crackdowns, tighter controls, harsher punishments. Isaiah watched this reaction with grim understanding. When power feels threatened, it reaches first for brutality. He knew that the next phase would be the most dangerous, not only for him, but for everyone trapped within the collapsing structure. Yet even as fear pressed in, Isaiah felt a strange calm settle over him. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was no longer unclear. The secrets he had carried were no longer inert. They were moving, multiplying, reshaping the city. Natchez's darkest truths were surfacing not as confessions, but as consequences, and Isaiah, having set the process in motion, understood that the city would soon demand a reckoning, whether it was prepared for one or not. By the time winter crept into Natchez with its damp mornings and long watchful nights, the city had entered a phase where fear no longer whispered but breathed openly through its streets, and Isaiah could feel that the momentum he had initiated was now carrying itself forward with a force that no single person could restrain, least of all him. What unsettled him most was not the aristocrats' panic, but their transformation. Men who once operated with cold calculation now behaved like cornered animals, striking wildly, making choices driven not by strategy but by survival, and in that desperation they began exposing fractures that had been hidden even from one another. Committees were formed, unofficial gatherings cloaked as social calls, where men spoke in hushed tones about loyalty and betrayal, about who could still be trusted and who had become a liability. Isaiah watched as the same names surfaced again and again, not because they were the most guilty, but because they were the least disciplined, the ones whose composure had always been an illusion maintained by comfort. He realized that privilege had insulated these men from the consequences of their own instability, and now, stripped of certainty, they unraveled with alarming speed. One aristocrat attempted to flee the city under the pretense of illness, only to be intercepted by creditors suddenly emboldened by rumor. Another locked himself inside his estate, dismissing servants and relying solely on family, a move that only amplified suspicion. Isaiah absorbed all of this quietly, understanding that the city itself had become an echo chamber, where every action was interpreted as confession, every silence as proof of guilt. As scrutiny intensified, the violence that had long existed beneath Natchez's civility began to surface more openly. Enslaved people were punished preemptively, accused of knowing too much simply for being present in the wrong places at the wrong times. Overseers tightened control, mistaking cruelty for authority, and in doing so created more witnesses, more resentment, more potential fractures. Isaiah felt the weight of this escalation keenly. This was the cost he had feared, the collateral suffering that accompanied any disruption of entrenched power. Yet he also saw something else emerging alongside the brutality: awareness. People who had never questioned the system before began to notice its instability, began to ask why so many powerful men were suddenly afraid, why justice, long dormant, seemed to be stirring. Isaiah did not speak to them, did not offer explanations or encouragement. He understood that revelation, to be durable, had to arise organically. Truth imposed could be dismissed, truth discovered could not. The aristocratic network responded by attempting consolidation, drawing tighter around itself, offering mutual assurances and shared strategies for deflection. They agreed on narratives, rehearsed responses, planned scapegoats. Isaiah recognized this phase as the most dangerous, because coordination, even among fearful men, could still produce decisive action. He knew they would look for a singular cause, a focal point they could eliminate to restore order. This knowledge forced him to alter his approach. He withdrew further from direct proximity, becoming almost spectral in his movements, ensuring that his presence left no discernible imprint. At the same time, he intensified the indirect pressures, allowing inconsistencies to surface in official records, encouraging the re-examination of old testimonies by simply ensuring they were not forgotten. He understood that institutions, once nudged, possessed inertia of their own. Bureaucracy, often used to bury truth, could also exhume it if the right questions were asked loudly enough, often enough. What Isaiah did not anticipate was how quickly the network's internal mistrust would metastasize into outright hostility. Accusations, once whispered, became confrontations. Alliances fractured along old rivalries, resurfacing grievances that had been suppressed for years. One aristocrat accused another of leaking information to authorities, a claim that could not be proven but also could not be dismissed. The accused responded with counter-accusations, and suddenly the unified front dissolved into factions, each convinced that the other had betrayed the collective. Isaiah observed this with a mixture of grim satisfaction and apprehension. Chaos, once unleashed, rarely confines itself to intended targets. He had wanted exposure, reckoning, not collapse, yet collapse now seemed inevitable. As winter deepened, so did the consequences. Investigations expanded beyond their original scope, pulling in names that had once seemed untouchable. Properties were seized pending inquiry. Fortunes began to erode. The city's elite, accustomed to directing outcomes, found themselves reacting instead, always a step behind events they no longer controlled. Isaiah sensed that the narrative was shifting, that the story Natchez told itself about its own righteousness was beginning to crack. Still, he remained invisible, resisting the urge to intervene more directly. He knew that revelation, like rot, needed time to spread through the structure before it could bring it down. Privately, Isaiah grappled with exhaustion, the constant vigilance, the necessity of restraint, the awareness that discovery would mean not only his death, but retaliation against countless others, weighed heavily on him. He had moments where he questioned whether the city would truly change or simply absorb the damage and rebuild itself atop new lies. Yet each time doubt threatened to paralyze him, he remembered the faces of those erased by silence, the stories that had never been told because telling them meant annihilation. Those memories anchored him. He reminded himself that transformation did not always announce itself dramatically. Sometimes it unfolded as erosion, slow and relentless. The aristocrats' final attempt at control came in the form of spectacle. They organized public displays of unity, charitable events, declarations of moral authority meant to reassure the populace and intimidate dissent. Isaiah recognized this tactic immediately. Power, when threatened, often resorts to performance. But performance requires belief, and belief was in short supply. The city watched these displays with skepticism, interpreting them not as strength, but as overcompensation. Behind closed doors, the same men who smiled publicly were accusing one another of sabotage, preparing contingencies for betrayal. Isaiah understood that the network had reached its breaking point. As spring approached, bringing with it the promise of renewal, Natchez stood on the precipice of irreversible change. Investigations converged, testimonies aligned, patterns emerged that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The aristocracy, once a monolith, now resembled a collapsing facade, its internal scaffolding exposed and failing. Isaiah felt a profound, unsettling calm. The most dangerous phase was nearing completion, and with it came uncertainty not just about the city's future, but about his own. He had set forces in motion that would outlive him, reshape narratives, and challenge assumptions that had governed Natchez for generations. Whether he would survive to see that transformation was unknown. What he did know, with absolute clarity, was that the city could never return to what it had been. The secrets were no longer buried. They were alive, circulating, demanding acknowledgement. And as Natchez braced for the reckoning to come, Isaiah remained where he had always been, unseen, indispensable, and irrevocably entwined with the collapse of the world that had tried to erase him. By the time the first official indictments were whispered about in Natchez, the city had already begun to fracture along invisible fault lines that Isaiah could sense more keenly than anyone else, because he was the one who had learned to read fear not in words but in habits, in the way men changed their routes through town, in the sudden reluctance to make eye contact, in the nervous generosity of those who had once been. Notoriously tight-fisted, the aristocracy no longer moved as a unified organism. It twitched, spasmed, reacted. Old families who had intermarried for generations now avoided one another at church, choosing opposite pews like adversaries rather than kin. Dinner invitations were rescinded without explanation. Long-standing business partnerships quietly dissolved. Isaiah understood that this was the stage where collapse accelerated, because distrust was now self-sustaining. No new revelations were needed to deepen the damage. The mere possibility of exposure was enough to poison every interaction. He had reached a point where his direct involvement became almost irrelevant. The machine he had destabilized was tearing itself apart under its own weight, each cog grinding against the next in a desperate attempt to escape blame. What unsettled Isaiah, however, was how swiftly the violence of this unraveling shifted downward. The aristocrats, terrified of losing control, intensified their domination over those beneath them, as though cruelty could reassert hierarchy. Enslaved people were interrogated, beaten, accused of conspiracy simply for surviving long enough to be witnesses to decades of excess. Overseers were ordered to extract confessions that no one expected to be truthful, because truth was no longer the objective, fear was. Isaiah saw this escalation with a bitter clarity. He had always known that power, when threatened, lashes out blindly, but witnessing it unfold did not dull its brutality. He moved carefully, redirecting suspicion when he could, erasing traces when necessary, ensuring that no single enslaved person became a focal point for collective punishment. This was the most delicate phase of his work, because intervention now required precision. A single misstep could collapse the fragile misdirection he had built and bring catastrophic retaliation. Meanwhile, the legal machinery of Natchez, long accustomed to serving elite interests, found itself in unfamiliar territory. Judges hesitated. Clerks delayed filings. Sheriffs enforced orders selectively, unsure which names were still protected and which had become liabilities. Isaiah observed how quickly institutional confidence eroded when its patrons faltered. Men who had once interpreted law as a flexible instrument suddenly discovered its rigidity when it turned inward. This inversion fascinated Isaiah, not as spectacle but as confirmation of something he had always understood intuitively. Systems are only as strong as the belief that they will be enforced consistently. Once that belief fractures, obedience becomes conditional, and conditional obedience is indistinguishable from rebellion. As rumors of arrests grew louder, the aristocrats attempted one final strategy: sacrifice. Quiet meetings produced lists of expendable names, individuals whose removal might appease public scrutiny and preserve the core of the network. These were not the worst offenders, Isaiah noticed, but the least connected, the ones whose absence would not destabilize too many alliances. This calculus, cold and methodical, disgusted him even as it confirmed his understanding of how power operated. Loyalty, in these circles, had always been transactional. Now the transaction was survival. Isaiah allowed these sacrifices to proceed, knowing that partial justice, while insufficient, could still widen cracks rather than seal them. Each indictment validated the narrative that wrongdoing existed, making it harder to dismiss subsequent revelations as aberrations. Privately, Isaiah struggled with the moral weight of what he had unleashed. He had wanted accountability, not martyrdom. Yet he also knew that the aristocrats' willingness to devour their own exposed the emptiness at the heart of their authority. A system that cannibalized itself could not claim moral legitimacy. This realization strengthened his resolve. Even as it deepened his isolation, he could not share his doubts or reflections with anyone. To do so would risk everything. His existence remained a paradox, central to the collapse, yet utterly alone within it. As spring matured into summer, Natchez transformed into a city living under siege by its own conscience. The economy faltered as investments froze and trade partners grew wary. Social events dwindled, replaced by hushed gatherings where conversations circled endlessly around the same questions: who knows what? Who will speak next? Who can still be trusted? Isaiah moved through these spaces like a ghost, invisible yet attentive, absorbing the atmosphere of collective paranoia. He understood that fear had become the city's primary currency, and like all currencies, it circulated unevenly, enriching some while impoverishing others. The most significant shift, however, occurred quietly, without proclamation. Enslaved people began to speak to one another differently, not openly, not recklessly, but with a subtle confidence that Isaiah recognized immediately. They had seen the unthinkable happen: powerful men shaken, authority questioned, consequences imposed. This awareness did not translate into immediate rebellion, but it altered perception. The world no longer appeared immutable. Isaiah regarded this change as the most meaningful outcome of his actions, even more than indictments or ruined fortunes. Consciousness, once awakened, rarely returns to dormancy. The aristocracy sensed this shift too, and it terrified them more than any legal threat. Control depended not only on force, but on belief in inevitability, in permanence. That belief was eroding. Isaiah knew that even if every investigation were halted, even if every indictment were dismissed, the psychological transformation could not be undone. Natchez had glimpsed its own vulnerability, and so had those it had long oppressed. As the city hurtled toward an uncertain reckoning, Isaiah felt the narrowing of possibilities. His margin for error shrank daily, yet within that narrowing he experienced a strange clarity. The story no longer belonged to him alone. It belonged to Natchez, to its victims, to its future. He had been the catalyst, not the conclusion. And as the aristocracy's carefully constructed world continued to collapse inward, Isaiah remained poised at the edge of revelation, aware that the final consequences, personal and collective, were drawing closer with every passing day. By the time summer reached its suffocating peak, Natchez no longer felt like a city unraveling, but like one holding its breath, suspended in a moment that could only resolve itself through rupture, and Isaiah sensed that this was the phase where consequences ceased to be abstract and became personal in ways that could no longer be managed from the shadows alone. The indictments that had once circulated as rumor were now spoken aloud, cautiously but unmistakably, in courthouses, taverns, and private parlors, where voices dropped instinctively at the mention of certain names. The aristocracy's attempt to control the narrative through selective sacrifice had failed to contain the damage. Instead, it had legitimized scrutiny itself. Once the public accepted that some of the powerful could fall, the question was no longer whether guilt existed, but how deep it ran. Investigators, emboldened by precedent and pressure, began revisiting cases long dismissed as unfortunate accidents or isolated tragedies. Drownings, unexplained illnesses, missing people whose absences had been smoothed over with money and influence, all of it resurfaced, threaded together by patterns that now seemed impossible to ignore. Isaiah watched this expansion with a mixture of grim satisfaction and tightening dread, because each reopened inquiry narrowed the space in which he could remain unseen. The closer truth moved toward coherence, the more dangerous anonymity became, not because exposure was imminent, but because desperate men tend to grasp wildly, striking at any shadow that suggests NC behind their suffering. The city's institutions, already destabilized, struggled to adapt to the accelerating pace of inquiry. Courts became battlegrounds of delay and obstruction, where motions were filed not to resolve cases, but to exhaust those pursuing them. Isaiah understood this tactic intimately. He had seen it deployed against enslaved people for years, justice deferred until it dissolved into irrelevance. What he had not anticipated was how poorly it would function when wielded against public momentum rather than individual petitioners. Delays bred suspicion. Every postponement was interpreted as concealment. The aristocrats' legal maneuvers, once effective shields, now appeared as admissions of fear. Isaiah recognized that the balance had tipped. Resistance was no longer stabilizing but corrosive. Yet even as the machinery of accountability lurched forward, the cost continued to be borne disproportionately by those with the least protection. Retaliation intensified in quieter, more insidious forms. Families were separated under the guise of relocation. Individuals known for their proximity to powerful households were sold or transferred abruptly, their removals framed as routine transactions but understood by Isaiah as erasures. Each disappearance haunted him. He had calculated risk, accepted collateral damage as an inevitability of confrontation, but confronting its human reality gnawed at him relentlessly. He adjusted his strategies, intervening where possible to redirect suspicion, falsify records, delay transfers. These acts, small in isolation, accumulated into a fragile buffer against total devastation. Still, he knew he could not save everyone. This knowledge settled into him like a weight that no amount of resolve could fully lift. As the summer dragged on, the aristocracy's cohesion deteriorated further. Mutual accusations escalated into overt betrayals. One man, facing the loss of everything, provided testimony implicating former allies in exchange for leniency. Another attempted to flee, only to be apprehended and returned in chains, his humiliation a public spectacle that sent shockwaves through elite circles. Isaiah observed how swiftly loyalty evaporated under pressure, how men who had once spoken of honor now framed self-preservation as moral necessity. This collapse of shared identity fascinated Isaiah on a psychological level. The aristocracy had always relied on a narrative of inherent superiority, of natural entitlement. Now, stripped of collective immunity, individuals reverted to survival instincts indistinguishable from those they had long dehumanized. Within this chaos, Isaiah felt his own role shifting. He was no longer merely catalyzing events, he was responding to them, adapting to a landscape that changed daily. Information flowed unpredictably, alliances formed and dissolved without warning, the risk of exposure increased not through investigation but through chance, an overheard conversation, a misinterpreted gesture, a coincidence that aligned too neatly to ignore. Isaiah became acutely aware of his physical presence, of how often he appeared in the same spaces as unfolding events. He altered routines, avoided patterns, accepted isolation as the price of survival. Loneliness, once a familiar companion, deepened into something heavier, a sense of existing perpetually on the verge of erasure, neither fully alive nor entirely absent. Despite this, moments of quiet transformation continued to emerge. Enslaved people exchanged glances charged with meaning, subtle acknowledgments that something fundamental had shifted. Isaiah recognized these moments as seeds rather than outcomes. They did not herald immediate change, but they altered perception, recalibrated what seemed possible. He understood that oppression relies as much on imagination as on force, the imagination of inevitability. Once that imagination fractures, control becomes brittle. This realization sustained him during night, when fear pressed closest, when the temptation to disappear entirely whispered seductively. The aristocracy's final illusion, that time alone would heal the rupture, proved disastrously misguided. As autumn approached, the cumulative weight of inquiry, rumor, and visible consequence transformed Natchez into a city defined by anticipation rather than denial. People waited, for verdicts, for revelations, for collapse. The economy stagnated under the strain of uncertainty. Social hierarchies blurred as wealth lost its aura of invincibility. Isaiah sensed that the city was approaching a threshold, beyond which return to the old order would be impossible, regardless of legal outcomes. This understanding filled him with a cautious hope tempered by realism. Systems rarely collapse cleanly, they mutate, reconfigure, adapt. The struggle was not to destroy power, but to expose it to scrutiny, to strip it of unquestioned legitimacy. As Isaiah navigated this precarious moment, he felt the narrowing of his future paths with painful clarity. Escape remained an option, tantalizing in its promise of safety, but he understood what it would cost: absence from the reckoning he had helped initiate, abandonment of those who still depended on his quiet interventions. Staying, however, carried the growing probability of discovery, punishment, erasure. The choice weighed on him relentlessly, not as a single decision, but as a daily negotiation between fear and responsibility. He knew that whatever he chose, the consequences would reverberate beyond his own life. By the end of the season, Natchez stood irrevocably altered, its aristocracy exposed as fragile, its institutions shaken, its oppressed newly aware of the cracks in the edifice that had constrained them for generations. Isaiah remained unseen, but his presence permeated the city like a fault line, invisible yet decisive. The reckoning was no longer theoretical, it was imminent, and with it would come outcomes no one could fully predict. As the city edged closer to that moment, Isaiah prepared himself for the final phase, not knowing whether it would bring justice, destruction, or something more ambiguous, only knowing that retreat was no longer possible. As the first cold fronts of late autumn rolled through Natchez, Isaiah felt the city cross an invisible boundary, one where anticipation hardened into inevitability, and every breath carried the metallic taste of an ending that could no longer be delayed, because the machinery of exposure had gained a momentum that even its architects could not slow, and the aristocracy, stripped now of illusion, reacted not with unity or strategy, but with fragmentation so severe it bordered on self-destruction. The testimonies that had once been cautiously offered behind closed doors were now being repeated openly, their consistency impossible to dismiss, their cumulative weight-bending institutions that had resisted accountability for generations. Newspapers, once obedient mouthpieces for elite sensibilities, began printing carefully worded reports that nonetheless carried unmistakable implications, and Isaiah understood that when the press shifted tone, it signaled a deeper change than any single indictment ever could. Public discourse transformed. Conversations that had once been unthinkable now unfolded in taverns, at church steps, in markets, and though the language remained coded, the meaning was clear, the powerful were no longer immune. This realization rippled outward, unsettling not just those under investigation but anyone who had built identity on proximity to them. Old loyalties dissolved under scrutiny, and even those untouched by formal inquiry found themselves questioned, their wealth and status reinterpreted through a lens of suspicion that could not be easily escaped. Isaiah watched this process with a quiet intensity, aware that the city itself was participating in its own dissection, turning inward to examine the rot long concealed beneath CI. Vility, and in that collective turning, the risk to him increased exponentially, because patterns invite explanations, and explanations demand agents. The aristocrats, desperate to reclaim control, fixated on the idea of a hidden instigator, someone orchestrating their collapse, and while none could name him, the very act of searching made his existence more tangible, more dangerous. Isaiah responded by narrowing his footprint further, limiting movement, altering rhythms, ensuring that no single thread could be traced consistently back to him, yet he knew that anonymity grows fragile when fear sharpens perception, and fear now saturated Natchez like humidity. Retaliation intensified in unpredictable ways. Some families purged servants wholesale, replacing them with unfamiliar faces, severing lines of memory and testimony. Others clung obsessively to those they trusted, monitoring every interaction, mistaking surveillance for security. Isaiah intervened sparingly, understanding that excessive manipulation would itself create anomalies, and instead relied on the city's own chaos to obscure his actions. Meanwhile, the psychological toll deepened. Nights became exercises in vigilance, sleep fractured by the constant recalculation of risk, and Isaiah felt time compress, days blurring into a single sustained moment of tension. Yet within this strain, clarity emerged. He recognized that the aristocracy's greatest fear was no longer legal consequence, but narrative loss, the irreversible shift in how they would be remembered, how their authority would be contextualized once stripped of mystique. Power could survive scandal, even punishment, but it could not survive exposure that redefined it as illegitimate. This understanding steadied him. He was not merely dismantling individual fortunes, he was altering the story Natchez told itself about who deserved control. As winter approached in earnest, that story fractured further. Verdicts loomed, alliances collapsed, and the city's elite retreated into isolation, their grand homes transformed into fortresses of paranoia. Isaiah sensed that the final act was nearing, not as a single dramatic moment, but as an accumulation of irreversible shifts, and he prepared himself for the possibility that survival and completion might no longer align. He had always known this path carried no guarantees, but now the truth crystallized. Even if he vanished tomorrow, the consequences would continue unfolding, the consciousness he had helped awaken would persist, and Natchez would never fully return to the complacent certainty that had sustained its cruelty. In this knowledge, Isaiah found a grim peace. He had moved the immovable, cracked the uncrackable, and forced a reckoning that could not be quietly undone. As the city braced itself for outcomes it could sense but not yet see, Isaiah remained within it, unseen and increasingly unnecessary, aware that the most dangerous phase of any upheaval is not its ignition but its conclusion, when fear, guilt and desperation converge, and the past finally demands payment in full. By the time winter fully claimed Natchez, the reckoning no longer felt like something approaching from the distance, but like a presence already seated among them, silent and immovable, and Isaiah understood with an almost painful clarity that this final phase was not about spectacle or triumph, but about endurance, about what remained standing after illusion, denial, and inherited certainty had finally burned themselves out. The trials that unfolded did not arrive with the cathartic force many had imagined. There were no single moments of dramatic collapse, no instant where justice felt clean or complete. Instead, there was a grinding sequence of hearings, testimonies, adjournments, and verdicts that chipped away relentlessly at reputations once thought untouchable. Some aristocrats fell publicly, their names etched into record books not as benefactors or patriarchs, but as perpetrators of CRI, mess long disguised as accidents, misfortunes, or necessary discipline. Others escaped formal conviction through technicalities, dying shortly after or retreating into obscurity, but Isaiah knew that even these apparent survivals were hollow. They lived on stripped of narrative authority, their legacy poisoned by suspicion that no amount of wealth could fully erase. Natchez itself seemed to absorb this outcome somberly, as if recognizing that justice in such a place could never be pure, only partial and delayed, yet still devastating in its cumulative effect. The economy reshaped itself unevenly, old families selling land they could no longer maintain, new power centers emerging cautiously, aware now that permanence was an illusion. Social hierarchies loosened, not collapsing entirely, but losing their inevitability, and Isaiah sensed that this shift, subtle and incomplete as it was, mattered more than any individual sentence handed down by a court. Throughout it all, he remained unseen, increasingly unnecessary, his role diminishing as institutions, once nudged, continued moving on their own fractured momentum. This realization brought with it a quiet sorrow. Isaiah had lived so long as a function of resistance that the idea of existing without that purpose felt disorienting, almost hollow. Yet he also felt relief, because necessity had always been his greatest danger. The moment the city no longer required his guidance was the moment survival became possible again. As winter deepened, he withdrew further, allowing his presence to fade into memory, into rumor, into the vague sense that something or someone had accelerated events without ever revealing itself. There were nights when he considered leaving Natchez entirely, following the river north or west, dissolving into places where his name meant nothing, where the past could not so easily reach him. But there were also moments when he walked the city's quieter streets and felt something unfamiliar stir, ownership, not of land or power, but of impact. He had forced a confrontation between appearance and reality, and even though the outcome was imperfect, even though suffering had accompanied progress, the city had been changed in ways that could not be fully reversed. Enslaved people spoke more carefully now, but also more knowingly, their awareness sharpened by witnessing the vulnerability of those who once claimed divine authority over their lives. Children grew up hearing fragments of the truth, not the sanitized legends their parents had been fed, and Isaiah understood that history rarely transforms through singular heroes or clean victories. It shifts through accumulation, through the slow erosion of lies that once felt eternal. In the end, there was no moment where Isaiah stood revealed or celebrated, no acknowledgement of his role, and that anonymity felt appropriate. He had never sought recognition, only disruption. As Natchez settled into its altered state, wounded, quieter, less certain of itself, Isaiah prepared to disappear, not as a fugitive fleeing failure, but as a catalyst stepping aside once the reaction could sustain itself. And before the final image fades, before this story settles into the uneasy space between truth and memory, remember this. The most dangerous secrets in history are not buried because they are false, but because they are powerful enough to change who we believe ourselves to be. If stories like this matter to you, if you feel that pull toward the hidden corners of the past where voices were silenced on purpose, then subscribe to Born into Darkness, hit the bell icon so you don't miss what comes next, and leave a comment telling me how deeply this story stayed with you. Because history does not end, it waits, watching, for someone brave enough to uncover it.